Let's begin to gather again. Virgil, thank you so much for your great word, brother. When he was going through all of those scriptures about the word, I was getting chill bumps. It's so powerful, and to know. And on our wristband here, we have Psalm 119:11. I'll add to his list of scriptures about the word. But Psalm 119:11, I have stored your word up in my heart, that I might not sin against you. What a powerful tool we have. So that is my mission and goal in life, to help us hide the word in our heart melodically. So let's sing our Colossians 2:8 together. See to it that no one take you captive by philosophy, empty deceit, according to human tradition, according to the elemental spirit of the world, and not according to Christ, and not according to Christ. See to it that no one takes you captive by philosophy, empty deceit, according to human tradition, according to the elemental spirit of the world, and not according to Christ, and not according to Christ. Psalm 34. I sought the Lord, and he answered me, and delivered me from every fear. Those who look on him are radiant. They'll never be ashamed. They'll never be ashamed. This poor man cried, and the Lord heard me and saved me from my enemies. The Son of God surrounds his saints. He will deliver them. He will deliver them. Magnify the Lord with me. Come exalt his name together. Glorify the Lord with me. Come exalt his name forever. Oh, taste and see that the Lord is good. Oh, blessed is he who hides in him. Oh, fear the Lord. Oh, all you saints. He will everything. He'll give you all you need. Magnify the Lord with me. Come exalt his name together. Glorify the Lord with me. Come exalt his name forever. Let us bless the Lord every day and night. Never-ending praise. May our incense rise. Let us bless the Lord every day and night. Never-ending praise. May our incense rise. Let us bless the Lord every day and night, never-ending praise. May our incense rise. Let us bless the Lord every day and night, never-ending praise. May our incense rise. Magnify the Lord with me. Come exalt his name together. Glorify the Lord with me. Come exalt his name forever. Amen. Praise his holy name. Taste and see the Lord is good. You can be seated. Praise the Lord.
Well, have you enjoyed it so far? It's been great. You know, I introduced Darrell last night, and I teased him a little bit about the podcast on 9 ways to be a better white person. But the one thing they didn't talk about, well, they did, but I mentioned to him, I saw him, I don't know if you remember this, I saw you in Nashville at the conference, and I said, you know, number 10, the best way to be a better white person or a black person is on your knees in front of the Lord. And you said, absolutely. Yeah, and set the ball on the tee for you, Darrell, so come and share with us living by truth in a world of lies.
Am I on? No, hold on. Am I on now? Okay, great, guys. All right, good morning. Those of you who were here last night will recall I challenged you to commit to hearing everything that you would hear from Virgil and me through the lens of Colossians 2:8. Colossians 2:8, and I maintain that challenge to you this morning. Colossians 2:8, we've sung about it. We've talked about it. I just want to remind you of that text once again. See to it that no one takes you captive through philosophy and empty deception, according to the tradition of men, according to the elementary principles of the world, and not according to Christ. That's why we're here this weekend. That's why we're here to talk about living biblically in a woke world. As Mark just alluded to a second ago, the title of my message this morning is Living by Truth in a World of Lies. Living by truth in a world of lies. Quid est veritas? Does anyone here speak Latin? Quid est veritas? What is truth? What is truth? That question is, of course, taken from John 18:38, a text that I like to refer to as the verse heard round the world. John 18:38, the verse heard round the world. I describe that verse in those terms because it's been my experience that whenever the subject of truth is raised, it is that particular inquiry by Pontius Pilate in John 18:38 that seems invariably to register in the minds of people, where Pilate asks, what is truth? The problem, however, is that although countless people, including many professing Christians, may be familiar at a surface level with the question that Pilate raised, the vast majority of them have no idea how to objectively respond to that question if they were ever challenged to do so. I mean, what would be your response if someone walked up to you on your job or at school or you're at a restaurant somewhere and they asked you, well, what is truth? How would you answer that question? Now, I make that assertion against the backdrop of what John MacArthur writes in his book, The Truth War, Fighting for Certainty in an Age of Deception, where Dr. MacArthur says this, quote, people no longer believe in truth as a sure and knowledgeable reality. Many self-styled evangelicals today are openly questioning whether such a thing as truth even exists. Others suppose that even if truth does exist, we can't be sure what it is. So it can't really matter much. The twin problems of uncertainty and apathy about the truth are epidemic, even among some of the evangelical movement's most popular authors and spokespersons. Some flatly refuse to stand for anything because they have decided that even Scripture isn't really clear enough to argue about. The church's duty, MacArthur says, has always been to confront such skepticism and answer it by clearly proclaiming the truth God has revealed in His Word, unquote. And that is the responsibility for every single Christian in this room, is to be able to clearly proclaim the truth that God has revealed in His Word. You have no excuse not to be prepared to do that. One rather glaring example of the uncertainty and apathy of which Pastor MacArthur is speaking is a Washington Times article dated October 20th, 2021, that cites what's called an American Worldview Inventory survey conducted by the Barna Group, consisting of 2,000 U.S. adults from the Cultural Research Center at Arizona Christian University. Now, why do I emphasize Christian? Because of what you're about to hear me say. This is a poll, a survey rather, by the Barna Group that consisted of 2,000 U.S. adults from the Cultural Research Center at Arizona Christian University, in which 54% of the survey's participants embraced the postmodern idea that all truth is subjective and that there are no moral absolutes. So the majority of these adults surveyed at Arizona Christian University agreed that there are no moral absolutes and that truth is subjective. Each of you came here this morning on the basis of truth. When you looked at the clock, you believed what time it was. You believe that it is truly 7:30. You believe that you were truly awake and alive. You believe that this truly is coffee that I'm drinking. You didn't try to convince yourself that, well, this coffee is really orange juice. You didn't wake up with some relativistic idea of what was going on around you. I believe that I'm actually standing at this pulpit. I'm not a relativist right now. But 54% of people surveyed at Arizona Christian University. An excerpt from the article that I just cited, that Washington Times article, reads as follows. The survey, which sampled 1,000 people by telephone and another 1,000 people through online questionnaires, found that 88% of the respondents said they fashion a unique philosophy of life from the, listen to this, they fashion a unique philosophy of life from the personally appealing parts of multiple worldviews. The personally appealing parts of multiple worldviews. Mr. Barna, I'm still quoting the article, Mr. Barna, who founded the evangelical Christian polling firm, the Barna Group, in 1984, says this makes syncretism the most dominant worldview guiding the decisions of Americans today. Now let me pause right here. There's been arguments back and forth about whether the United States is a Christian nation or not. That's really not the question. The question is whether America is a syncretic nation or not. America is a nation of syncretists. We are a nation where people, just like it says here in this Barna article, have taken and live by a philosophy of life where they take personally appealing parts of multiple worldviews and say, well, this is what I believe. Barna says, quote, if there's no absolute moral truth when the government is telling me this is the right thing to do, I'm going to automatically question it because of a bunch of yahoos in Washington put it together. I'm quoting Barna. Those aren't my words. Barna said, if there's no absolute moral truth when the government is telling me this is the right thing to do, I'm going to automatically question it because a bunch of yahoos in Washington put it together. Because everything is based on my needs and my feelings. I may choose to ignore the law and feel no remorse about that because I have to take care of myself, he said. This is exactly the logic that goes into every abortion clinic. When that woman walks in there, and Virgil can attest to this, Virgil's been doing abortion clinic ministry for over a dozen years. This is exactly the rationale that they take into that abortion clinic, despite the pleas of people like Virgil, despite the pleas of other Christians who are out there with pleading them, with the help that they're offering them, the assurance that they can take care of that baby. Do not murder your baby. They say, no, I have to take care of myself. I don't feel any remorse, well, so they say. I have to do what's best for me. The article goes on to say this. The next most dominant worldviews in the survey, okay, in addition to syncretism, below syncretism, the next most dominant worldviews in the survey were biblical theism and moralistic therapeutic deism, with postmodernism and secular humanism tied after that as the life philosophies that Americans most often rely upon in making choices. So you have syncretism, biblical theism, moralistic therapeutic deism, with postmodernism and secular humanism tied after that as the life philosophies that Americans most often rely upon in making choices. All this to say that we're living in a society right now where truth is totally subjective. It's totally subjective. I mean, did you catch that earlier? They're attracted to the personally appealing parts of multiple worldviews. Now, that survey is but one example that you and I are living in a world in which truth, and to the surprise, I'm sure, of no one in this room, is becoming an increasingly relativistic proposition, one that is built upon the shifting sands of whatever an individual's felt needs happen to be. Now, as you continue to sit there and listen to my message this morning, I want you to hold on to that phrase, felt needs. Felt needs. That sobering reminder, that sobering reality, rather, that people are building their foundations of their worldview on the shifting sands of multiple philosophies and ideologies. That reality is fortified by Dr. Neil Burton in an August 2018 article for Psychology Today titled, What is Truth?, subtitled An Overview of the Philosophy of Truth, in which he writes this, quote, for some thinkers, something can only be true or false if it is open to verification, at least in theory, if not also in practice. The truth of something lies at the end of our inquiry into that thing. But as our inquiry can have no end, the truth of something can never be more than our best opinion of that thing. Did you hear that? The truth of something can never be more than our best opinion of that thing. If best opinion is all that we can have or hope for, then best opinion is as good as truth, and truth is a redundant concept, unquote. Do you hear what he's arguing here? That the truth of something can never be more than our best opinion. So what you're going to find yourself in the world out there, you're going to be on this hamster wheel of people arguing what their opinions are of what truth is. Well, my opinion is this. Well, my opinion is that. My opinion is this. It's a hamster wheel that you never get off of. And unfortunately, what Dr. Burton said there is a sad testament to the fact that the truth is increasingly being rejected today, even among professing Christians. You take Harvard University, for example. And what's happening right now is we sit here in this room. You have pro-Palestinian protesters, pro-Israeli protesters going at each other on the campus of Harvard University, which when it was founded by the Puritans, by the way, their motto was originally the truth of Christ, Veritas Christus. Now it's just Veritas. They dropped the Christus. Every single Ivy League institution was founded to teach and train gospel missionaries to go out around the world to preach the gospel. Now look at every last one of them. Now, you would never know that. The Apostle John declares in 1 John 2:21, I have not written to you because you do not know the truth, but because you do know it, and because no lie is of the truth. This is where I get the title of my message from 1 John 2:21, living by truth in a world of lies. John says, you know the truth, and you know that you also know that no lie is of the truth. No lie is of the truth. Now I want to exegete that word lie for a moment. You may think it's somewhat of an innocuous term, but it's really not. The word lie in 1 John 2:21 is the Greek noun pseudos. P-S-E-U-D-O-S, P-S-E-U-D-O-S, which in a narrow context refers to conscious and intentional falsehood. In a narrower sense, pseudos is conscious and intentional falsehood about something. But in a broader sense, the word lie also refers to whatever is not what it appears or seems to be. Pseudos is whatever is not what it appears or seems to be. So biblically speaking, a lie is whatever is said to not be reality. Or to put it another way, a lie is whatever is said to not be objectively real. And what do I mean by objectively real? Well, I mean reality as God defines it. Reality as God defines it in his word. As the late Dr. R.C. Sproul writes in his book, Truths We Confess, a systematic exposition of the Westminster Confession of Faith, quote, Christianity affirms that we have a revealed religion. We learn things from God that we could never learn through pure human speculation, rational deduction, or sense perception. What we call revelation does not eliminate the mind or the senses. Did you hear that? What we call revelation does not eliminate the mind or the senses. We are thinking beings encapsulated in human bodies. God gives revelation through his spokesman that is not available from any other source. Once we know with our minds and with our senses that God is there, and once we become convinced that this is his word, then we come in touch with a source of truth that transcends anything that we can have in this world, unquote. So reality, and another word for reality is truth, must be defined and understood in accordance with what God has revealed to us in his word. To again quote Dr. R.C. Sproul from a teaching series he did some years ago for Ligonier Ministries titled Truth Corresponds to Reality, quote, truth is not preference. Did you hear that? Truth is not preference. Truth is not a subjective inclination in an individual's heart, but truth is that which is real apart from me, unquote. Truth is real despite what you think, despite what you feel, despite your felt needs. In other words, truth is never, ever subjective, never. Rather, it is always objective. Truth is always objective. It is never subjective. Take yourself out of it. Take your felt needs out of it. Truth is truth despite what you think or feel. I don't know if this movement verge has really gained steam or lost it altogether, but it wasn't long ago well, this sort of woke segment of the culture was trying to push the idea to you that 2 + 2 = 5. That 2 + 2 could actually equal 5. And I've said often as Melissa and I travel across the country, thank God my pilot doesn't believe that. You couldn't get the plane off the ground if you believe 2 + 2 = 5. There are any number of lies that are being embraced today by the world. There are the lies of critical race theory that promote ethnic division and classism. There are the pagan lies of the climate change movement, which is fundamentally rooted in the pantheistic worship of Gaia, or Mother Earth, as opposed to worshiping the Creator. There are also the lies of the social justice movement, which by means of such divisive concepts as DEI and critical race theory promote cultural Marxism under the false pretense of equity and justice. Speaking of justice, let me just diverge here real quick. I gave you yesterday a one-verse apologetic against the idea of race, which was Acts 17:26. Today I want to give you a one-verse apologetic against the idea of social justice. That verse is Leviticus 19:15. Leviticus 19:15. In which, when you analyze Leviticus 19:15 against the social justice movement, where in the social justice movement they always want to give deference to the poor in opposition to the wealthy, and then pit those two groups together. That's where the classism comes in. They want to put those two classes of groups against one another. Leviticus 19:15, God commands his people to not even give deference to the poor. You shall do no injustice. You shall not give deference to the poor or to the great. So in God's eyes, it is also a sin to give deference to the poor under the guise of justice. So that's true justice. True justice in God's eyes is you don't try to force or manufacture outcomes. If I don't pay my mortgage, if I'm not responsible as a professing believer, and I'm not a good steward of the finances that God gives me, and I don't pay my mortgage every month and I get foreclosed on, see, in God's eyes, that's consequence. You're not obligated to come bail me out. See, God sees even giving deference to the poor as a sin. This is happening right now in LA as I speak. You have a DA, a district attorney in Los Angeles, who refuses to arrest and prosecute anyone who steals from a store where what they steal is valued at $950 or less, under the guise of restorative justice, especially if they're black, if the perpetrators are black. Because you're owed this, because of what my ancestors did to your ancestors, you're owed this. So there are mobs of people that rush into these stores in downtown LA and in downtown San Francisco. They do this because they know they're not going to be prosecuted under a sort of misunderstanding, to say the least, of what justice and equity is. But see, in God's eyes, every last one of those people will be arrested, prosecuted, and put in jail. That's stealing. It's still stealing. But no, in LA, it's restorative justice. It's equity. You see, but as destructive as all these ideologies are, the DEI, the critical race theory, the climate change, I want you to recall the definition of the word lie, pseudos, that I gave you earlier, and consider that definition against the backdrop of what I would consider and what I would be rather dogmatic about arguing is the most egregious, the most sinister, the most demonic and destructive lie confronting not only the culture today, but also the church. That is namely the lie of transgenderism and gender fluidity. By the way, from a biblical counseling standpoint, this is the new battleground in biblical counseling, is transgenderism. This is the new battleground. Transgenderism or gender fluidity, remember, one of the definitions of pseudos is a conscious and intentional falsehood. Transgenderism and gender fluidity, the conscious and intentional falsehood that a male can somehow transition or morph into a female, and conversely, a female to a male. As Virgil and I travel the country, I coined the phrase, and I use it in this context, how Christians are responsible for learning how to exegete the culture. And what I mean by that, you need to learn to exegete the language and the vernacular, the nomenclature of the culture. One way to do that when you talk about transgenderism is to actually exegete that word and take it apart. The prefix trans means to morph into a different shape or form than what you are by nature. Transgenderism, then, argues that a person can inherently and autonomously change their form of gender, which we all know is fixed. But because a man can put on a dress and a pair of stilettos and some lipstick and a wig, he now thinks he's transformed his gender. Likewise, a woman can cut her hair, not wear traditionally feminine clothing, wear pants, a button-down shirt, a jacket, put on a necktie, and she now considers herself as having transitioned from female to male, when all they've done is change their exterior appearance. But this is how the culture takes a fixed definition and then they redefine it. And among the early advocates of this concept of gender identity was a psychiatrist by the name of Dr. Robert J. Stoller. That last name is Stoller. Dr. Robert J. Stoller. Dr. Stoller, who died in a car crash in 1991 at the age of 66, was considered among the leading pioneers in the areas of human sexuality and gender studies in the 1960s, 70s, 80s. And in 1985, he published a book titled Presentations of Gender. Presentations of Gender, in which he said he defined gender identity as follows, quote, he said, Dr. Stoller, quote, that gender identity refers to the mix of masculinity and femininity in an individual, implying that both masculinity and femininity are found in everyone, but in different forms and to differing degrees. It is not the same as maleness and femaleness, which connote biology. So he's making a distinction between, and again, this is why you have to exegete these terms. They are nuancing words that are almost spelled exactly alike. But it's like Virgil said earlier. Here we have an example of a difference between what is right and what's almost right. He's saying masculinity and femininity aren't the same as maleness and femaleness. He says gender identity implies, listen to this, psychologically motivated behavior. Gender identity implies not biology, psychologically motivated behavior. Though masculinity fits well with maleness and femininity goes with femaleness, now he's arguing that they're related when he just argued 2 sentences ago that they're not the same thing. One is psychological and one is biological. Now he's arguing that they're connected. Though masculinity fits well with maleness and femininity goes with femaleness, sex and gender are not necessarily directly related. Many biologically intact men have to avoid, now I asked you earlier to keep that phrase felt needs in mind. Many biologically intact men, I'm sorry guys, I have to keep pausing in this quote rather that I'm very familiar with. It's just he's contradicting himself time after time after time. He's arguing earlier that maleness and masculinity are not biological. Now in this sentence, he's saying it is. Many biologically intact men, when he just argued that maleness and masculinity are not biological. Many biological intact men have to avoid what they feel are feminine impulses and behavior. The converse is true for women. There can even be rather complete, listen to this nonsense, there can even be rather complete gender reversal as in the case of biologically normal males or females who live as members of the opposite sex. Not are, but just they live as. They live as members of the opposite sex. But these I'm still quoting Dr. Stoller, but these designations do not serve us well unless we are also clear about what is meant by masculinity and femininity. Masculinity and femininity are defined here as any quality that is felt by its possessor to be masculine or feminine. I mean, I wrote this message, guys. I'm familiar with this stuff, but even as I read it, I'm just blown away by the insanity of it. Gender identity, just to boil down what Dr. Stoller says, gender identity can be defined as whatever you feel, whatever gender you feel like you are. That ambiguity, that relativistic idea of gender has spawned an entire industry where everything from gender dysphoria to whatever they want to call it. Do you realize that the number of gender transition clinics since 2017 to 2022 has grown by 75% in this country? All because people feel. So far from being an innocuous matter of being your authentic self, as many transgender evangelists claim, and I call them evangelists deliberately. These pro-transgender folks are evangelists, and they're after your children. They're after your children. So it's not just a matter of being your authentic self. Gender identity is a worldview. It's a worldview. It is a nonsensical, irrational, psychological construct that is rooted not in objective biological science, but in the subjectivity of confused feelings and emotions. Emotions that are being experienced by some of the most naive and vulnerable among us. I mean, I'll just use myself as an example. At 15 years old, I thought I wanted to get married. I had such a crush on this girl. I thought I wanted to get, I was so dumb. I remember sitting in a chair, talking to my parents. Both of them said, I want to marry this girl. Because of what I felt for her. Dumb. That's like D-U-M-M, dumb. Don't even put the B on it. That was so dumb. That was like D-U-M-M, dumb. But see, what I'm trying to get you to understand here is that this whole gender identity movement is taking advantage of young people who are immature. They don't know. When you're going through puberty, I mean, that could be a battle in and of itself. And this movement is taking advantage of young people who are confused, who are facing challenges in their life for the very first time. And they're taking advantage of this. As a matter of fact, I would argue, I can't prove this yet, but I would argue that the reason the LGBTQ2SIA mob adopted the rainbow flag as their icon is because those colors are make children naturally inquisitive. You put something colorful in front of a child, their eyes light up. This whole movement, they know what they're doing. They know what they're doing. That rainbow flag is not a challenge to God in terms of the Noahic covenant. That has nothing to do with that. They know that flag is attractive to young children. And they paste that rainbow on every kind of paraphernalia that you're going to see in public schools. So this is not some innocuous matter of being your authentic self. This entire movement is undergirded by people who want to take advantage of young people's feelings, what they're feeling right now. Dr. Ryan T. Anderson, president of the Ethics and Public Policy Foundation, exposes the insanity of the transgender gender identity ideology in a February 2018 article that he wrote for the Heritage Foundation, in which he writes this quote. This is a rather long passage, but I need you to hang in here with me. He says, quote, while activists claim that the possibilities for gender identity are rather expansive, man, woman, both, neither, they also insist that gender identity is innate or established at a very young age and thereafter immutable. Many of those who feel distress over their bodily sex know that they aren't really the opposite sex and do not wish to transition. They wish to receive help in coming to identify with and accept their bodily self. They don't think their feelings of gender dysphoria define reality, but transgender activists do. Regardless of whether they identify as cisgender or transgender, the activists promote a highly subjective and incoherent worldview. On the one hand, they claim that the real self is something other than the physical body, in a new form of Gnostic dualism. Yet at the same time, they embrace a materialist philosophy in which only the material world exists. They say that gender is purely a social construct while asserting that a person can be trapped in the wrong gender. They say there are no meaningful differences between man and woman, yet they rely on rigid sex stereotypes to argue that gender identity is real. Are you hearing how they contradict themselves? While human embodiment is not. So they argue that gender identity is real while human embodiment is not. They claim that truth is whatever a person says it is. Yet they believe there's a real self to be discovered inside that person. They promote a radical expressive individualism in which people are free to do whatever they want and define the truth however they wish, yet they try ruthlessly to enforce acceptance of transgender ideology, unquote. The more you examine the transgender agenda, it is inherently contradictory. They are after something. They're not trying to prove anything. The transgender movement is very eschatological. They are trying to create a new world here, is what they're trying to do. A world, that's what a worldview is designed to do. A worldview in practice is designed to create a world from that worldview. They don't make any sense. If you examine it, if you exegete the language and vernacular that they use, they contradict themselves. Now, speaking of trying to ruthlessly enforce acceptance of transgender ideology, in a tweet dated July 14th, 2023, the organization United Nations Women made the following declaration saying this, quote, "We must dismantle stereotypes about gender identity." Now, let me pause right there. This is from the Twitter account of United Nations Women. In the very first sentence, they say we must dismantle stereotypes about gender identity when the very name of their account establishes a gender stereotype. They contradict themselves, folks. It's like the comedian says, these jokes write themselves. I mean, you call yourself United Nations Women, and then you say we must dismantle stereotypes about gender identity. Well, let me continue with the quote. "We must dismantle stereotypes about gender identity, gender expression, and gender roles that are underpinned by patriarchal social norms. On International Non-Binary Peoples Day, on International Non-Binary Peoples Day, let's take time to reflect and learn #Non-Binary Day." Appended to that tweet was a graphic that defined gender identity as follows. Now, I've given you one definition of gender identity from the father of gender identity. Listen to how United Nations Women defines gender identity. Quote, "Gender identity is each person's deeply felt internal and individual experience of gender, which may or may not correspond to the sex they were assigned at birth or the gender attributed to them by society," unquote. I mean, are you hearing this? Each person's deeply felt. By the way, that tweet is replete with the language of queer Marxism. So never think that the LGBTQ movement is only about redefining terms. They're redefining terms. In other words, they're redefining reality. This is pseudos to the ultimate. This is pseudos to the ultimate. They are trying to create a whole new world. And we as Christians, we have to be able to answer this issue biblically. You have got to equip yourself to be able to answer this worldview biblically. But that notwithstanding, my question to you is, what would be your response to that tweet? If you'd read this tweet and you see that United Nations Women says that gender identity is each person's deeply felt internal and individual experience of gender, what would be your response to that? How would you argue against that? If you're a believer in this room right now, you are an apologist. 1 Peter 3:15. You're an apologist. What apologetic would you offer against this United Nations Women's tweet? Are you prepared to respond to their message with the truth? There are only two sexes, and because there are only two sexes, there's only two genders. You see, the transgender movement is a thoroughly iniquitous microcosm of what the world is like when it divorces itself from the truth of God. Up is down, down is up. 2 + 2 = 4. It is congenital to our nature as sinful human beings to want to be as far away from the truth of God as possible. And the transgender movement is evidence of that. They want to be far away from Genesis 2 as they possibly can. And when you see this across human history, usually when movements like this, first of all, they coalesce, they get larger, they gain steam, they gain victories either politically or legislatively. Usually what you find is that they want, in the end, to be able to sin without impunity, is what they want. This is really what they want. Melissa and I, we see this especially in California. California has got to be the most hedonistic state I've ever lived in. You have legislators out there who are always passing laws to give people more freedom to sin. The LGBTQ movement in California right now, I mean, they're eating off of silver plates. They're getting whatever they want, especially in terms of having access to your young children in public schools. And they're trying to make it harder and harder for parents to know what's going on within the classrooms that they're sending their children to. You've got legislators out there who have been arrested for child abuse, child pornography, but these are the people who serve, especially in California, in positions of administrations in public school systems. This is why these folks are graduating from these liberal institutions, and they're looking for jobs in public school systems. I have to be blunt with you here. It's because they want to molest your children. This is what they want. So again, it's congenital to our nature. We want to be as far away from the truth of God as possible. The 19th century Presbyterian theologian W.G.T. Shedd said this. I thought this was very profound. Shedd said, quote, "It is far easier for the intensely spiritual man to cultivate himself into a due regard for the outward and apparent than it is for the intensely earthly man to school himself into a spiritual way of thought. Indeed, it may be said of these two courses of cultivation that the former alone is really feasible. Man can come down from heaven to earth, but he cannot go up from earth to heaven. He can fall, but he cannot rise. Unquote. I mentioned Elon Musk yesterday and his humanism, his humanistic worldview. This is what Elon Musk does not get, what Shed is saying here. Elon Musk does not understand that man congenitally cannot go up from earth to heaven. He can only fall. He cannot rise in and of himself. All lies, regardless of what the lie specifically posits or proffers, begins with the rejection of the truth of God. Every single lie. I don't care if the lie is within your marriage, if it's within your family, if it's something outside of those boundaries. Every lie begins with a rejection of the truth of God. And in the same way that all truth leads us to God, all lies lead us away from God. And remember, the definition of lie is not only an intentional or conscious falsehood. A lie is also that which purports to not be reality. The world by nature wants nothing to do with God or conversely with His truth. The fundamental reason the world loves lies is that it hates God. It hates God because God is the one who defines what truth is and isn't. Theologian and author Dr. Dustin Benge. Dr. Dustin Benge, that last name is B-E-N-G-E. Dr. Dustin Benge, in the November 2020 edition of Table Talk magazine, in an article titled Truth in a World of Lies, said this, quote, "Throughout the millennia, Satan has not changed his strategy of deceit since his first encounter with Eve in the garden. He has inundated every area of society, from government, educational systems, and mass media to the family and even the church, with lies and half-truths. He has convinced the world, for instance, that life only begins at birth and not at conception, that living beings spring forth from non-living coincidence, that true happiness is found internally, that one's gender can be chosen, that eternal life is the result of many paths. We talked about that earlier with the Barna study, and so on." Ben says, closing, he says, Satan wants us to eat the deadly fruit of doubting truth. Unquote. You know, there was a time not long ago, each of us who are parents can relate to this. Did you ever think that you have to raise your child and one of the first things you would have to teach them is that you're a boy, you're a girl? Did you ever think that you would have to teach your child that? But that's where we are. Because the world has rejected God's truth. Proverbs 26:28 says, a lying tongue hates those it crushes. A lying tongue hates those it crushes. I like that verse because every lie, the impetus for every lie is really hate. It's really hate. I don't care what the lie is. A person lies because they hate the person they're lying to. By the way, that Hebrew verb crushes in Proverbs 26:28 means to oppress. The lies of the world are designed to not only deceive, but to destroy. The enemy comes to steal, to kill, and destroy. The lies of the world are designed not only to deceive, but to destroy. The lies of the world are oppressive to families, marriages, churches, cultures, societies, and entire nations. I mean, history is replete with examples of this. The Nazis murdered tens of millions of people on the basis of a lie that they believed about ethnic supremacy. The lie of Darwinian evolution, which to a great extent gave rise to the idea of scientific racism, and was a material factor in the advancement of slavery in America, led to a bloody civil war in which hundreds of thousands of people died. Almost 60,000 at Antietam alone. Because Darwin had convinced some people, well, this group, they bear the image of God, but this group doesn't. It was the Greek philosopher Plato who said this. He said, quote, "Truth is the beginning of every good thing, and he who would be blessed and happy should be from the first a partaker of the truth, that he may live a true man as long as possible, for then he can be trusted. But he is not to be trusted who loves voluntary falsehood, and he who loves voluntary falsehood is a fool," Pluto said. You see, the transgender movement is a prime example of voluntary falsehood. It is a foolish movement because it is a movement of fools. An article published by Reuters on October 6, 2022 said this. Listen to this. In 2021, about 42,000 children and teens across the United States received a diagnosis of gender dysphoria, nearly triple the number in 2017, according to data Komodo compiled for Reuters. Gender dysphoria is defined as the distress caused by a discrepancy between a person's gender identity and the one assigned to them at birth. I'm not done with this quote yet, but again, I beg you, learn to exegete this language. Discrepancy? The very use of that word argues that there is a standard somewhere where something went wrong. Gender dysphoria is defined as the distress caused by a discrepancy. Well, who's telling them there's a discrepancy? You know who's telling them? Their own parents, in many cases. Their own parents who will then, once they've been successful in convincing their boy or girl of this discrepancy, they broadcast it on TikTok. Still quoting from the article. Overall, the analysis found that at least 121,882 children ages 6 to 17 were diagnosed with gender dysphoria from 2017 through 2021. Reuters found similar trends when it requested state-level data on diagnoses among children covered by Medicaid, the public insurance program for lower-income families. Gender-affirming care for youths takes several forms, from social recognition of a preferred name and pronouns to medical interventions such as hormone therapy and sometimes surgery. A small but increasing number of U.S. children diagnosed with gender dysphoria are choosing medical interventions to express their identity and help alleviate their distress. Have y'all seen the pictures of these young people, especially young girls, who are having top surgery at 12, 13, 14, 15 years old? Because they've been convinced. Most times by their parents, in a lot of cases by their peers, that there's a discrepancy between who you are and who you are meant to be. So they go to some clinic somewhere to have hormone therapy undertaken. On an extreme case, go have top surgery performed. Because that will make me look like a boy. But what they don't get, that doesn't make you a boy. You see, as believers in Jesus Christ, we must have the courage to stand for truth against the lies of the world. Again, I have to ask you, what would be your apologetic against the transgenderism lie? We have to be courageous enough to stand for the truth against the lies of the world. I say that not only for the sake of our being salt and light in an ungodly society and culture, but more importantly for the sake of eternity, because souls are at stake here, folks. Souls are at stake here. I want to close with this encouragement to you. To live by truth in a world of lies, do not waver. Do not waver. Do not give up. Do not give in. I want to leave you with this encouragement from one of my favorite Puritan theologians, Thomas Watson. Thomas Watson wrote this in his book titled Heaven Taken by Storm. Watson said, quote, "What shall we be violent for if not for truth? Truth is ancient. Its gray hairs may make it venerable. It comes from him who is the Ancient of Days. Truth is unerring. It is the star that leads to Christ. Truth is pure." That's Psalm 119, verse 140. "It is compared to silver refined 7 times. Psalm 12, verse 6. There is not the least spot on truth's face. It breathes nothing but sanctity. Truth is triumphant. It is like a great conqueror. When all his enemies lie dead, it keeps the field and sets up its trophies of victory. Truth may be opposed, but never quite deposed. When the water in the Thames is lowest, a high tide is ready to come in. God is on truth's side, and so long as there is no fear, truth will prevail." Unquote. Do not fear. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Darrell and Virgil, so much. We need to hear the truth, as hard as it is to hear sometimes. All right, we are ahead of schedule. We're going to break for lunch. If you've got your questions, put them in a basket in the back. We'll be back here ready to go for the final session at 1 o'clock instead of 1:30, and we'll have you out of here by 2. So, all right, you're dismissed.